All right, we're back. Here's our third economic problem. We've done unemployment, done inflation. We looked at the Phillips curve and the trade-off. Lastly, we're going to look at distribution of income, the money that people make and how that's distributed amongst the population. Now, we got a couple of different types of poverty. We have what's called absolute and what's called relative poverty. And in absolute poverty, it means that literally people are dying because of poverty. On a day-to-day basis, they don't know where or if they're going to have food to eat. They don't have access to good health care, maybe clean water. The basic necessities of life are a day-to-day struggle. Relative poverty means that you are simply living with a lower standard of living than the average person in that economy. So when you think about it in the United States, are we a nation with absolute relative poverty? Take a moment to think about that. You can pause me. Okay, we're back. So yeah, in the United States, hopefully you thought, yeah, we're a nation with relative poverty. Okay, we have people who are poor. We have people in the United States who are very poor, we'll be honest, who struggle. But generally we do not have people who are starving to death. In fact, if you look at the statistics, generally speaking, people in the United States do not die of starvation unless there's some kind of underlying mental, emotional issue. There's generally, there's resources. But we do have, a significant problem in our country with the relative poverty in terms of people who are living well below the average standard of living. We know there are nations in the world, though, sub-Saharan Africa, parts of Asia, parts of South America, where absolute poverty is definitely a significant issue, where people are dying of starvation, of malnutrition, of lack of health care, of diseases that should be very preventable or maybe caused by, drinking water, things like that. Now, reasons for poverty, again, this would be a very sociological discussion. If you're taking Mr. Obenauer's class, you probably haven't. We know that there's definitely a cycle of poverty that we can observe that around the world. Many people born into poverty, they just never get out of it. It could be because they don't have access to education, where maybe they're born into a place where educational resources are lacking, or maybe if they're in a country where there's a lot of absolute poverty. They're forced to work on subsistence agriculture at a young age and not able to get the kind of education that would help them escape poverty. We also know that, poor health and poor nutrition generally leads to problems later on in life, which can exacerbate the problems of poverty. Again, we could get into we could do a unit on poverty and why there's a cycle. It's not part of the AP curriculum, but it's definitely something that's interesting. So, if you guys want to stop here and you want to have a little bit of a discussion on poverty and on why, you might see the cycle of it and why it's hard to escape that cycle, why don't you go ahead and pause me here and have a 3-5 minute conversation about that and then hit start again. So go. Okay, we're back. So, hopefully you had a little discussion there. We know that there is, different discussions being had around the world based on, your political ideologies about what can be done about poverty. And there's what's called equity of income, and there's what's called equality of income. Equality of income means that income should be distributed evenly. Everybody should have the same amount of income. Obviously, that's not an idea that flies well in the United States. A lot of people would have, words for that. You can shout them out at me now. You know what I'm talking about. But what most people would argue around the world is that there needs to be an equity of income. It means that the income needs to be distributed fairly. Okay, now, what does that mean? That's a very normative statement. Meaning, it's very opinion-based. You could definitely argue, and I think most people would agree with this argument, that those that are the most talented and the hardest working probably deserve the most amount of income. Okay? So equity does not mean equality. You've heard that before. Obviously, some people deserve more than others. The issue with equity is how much more than others, and why are they getting it. So Do we have an equity of income issue in the United States? That's an opinion. You could look at the statistics, look at what the top 1%, the top 20%, the top 50% make, and you can draw your own conclusions on that. Again, if you want to discuss that, well, let's pause it right here and you can discuss, equity in the United States and what you think about that. If you want to look up stats on your phone, go for it. So pause, go. Okay, we're back. So if you agree that there is an equity issue, then the next question is, what is the goal, or what should be the role of the government in redistributing income? Is it a goal of equality or equity? I think we've all determined that equality is kind of not what the United States is all about in terms of income. But does the government have a role in equity? And if you believe they do, then we'll get to that in a moment. Now, we have a little discussion here about how we can look at income equity and income equality. And what we use is a curve called the Lorenz curve. This is a curve that you will never have to draw for yourself. It's occasionally asked as a multiple choice question. And you can actually, this Gini index that we hear, you can cross that right out. We don't use that anymore in AP. Sometimes they used it in IB, which is why I kept it on here. So I'm going to go and take a look at this Lorenz curve here. And essentially what the Lorenz curve is showing us is what percentage of income each quintile of the population has. So if you look at the line of absolute equality, what that shows us here is that 20% of the population would be making 20% of the income. Okay? 40% of the population would be making 40%, and so on and so on. That would obviously be everybody making the same level of income, which we said, not really what we're looking for in the United States. Now, every nation has its own Lorenz curve. Now, if the nation was a true, real, in theory, communist country, which, doesn't really ever exist, then what you would have is, they would be that line of absolute equality. But if you look at a nation like Croatia, you can see that in that nation, 20% of the population is making about 10% of the income. 40% of the population, about a little more than 20%, and so on, leads you to the top. It means that 80% of the population brings in 60% of the income, which tells us that the top 20% of income earners make 40% of the nation's money. When you look at a nation like Brazil, a lot more income inequality there. 20% of the population is making maybe, 6 or 7% of the income. And you can go on and so on, and you get to the 80%. 80% makes 40%, meaning the top 20% of the people in Brazil, 60% of the income. So you can see the farther away the Lorenz curve is from the line of absolute equality, the more unequal that nation is. So, how can governments redistribute income? Okay, and the first issue, obviously, is should they redistribute income? Some of you would say, no, that's not the role of the government to try to create equity. So hopefully you guys already had that discussion. But if we want to talk about how they would do it, there's a number of ways they would do it. Most of that involves first taxing and then social programs. So if you look at different taxes, we got what we call a direct tax, and that's a tax that we generally impose right on somebody's income or on their wealth or on a firm's profits. We think of a direct tax as more of an income tax. All right, and we know in the United States and in many, many countries around the world, it is a graduated or progressive tax. The more you make, the more you pay. And the idea of that is to try to create some equity by taxing those that are most able to pay the tax at a higher rate. Some nations have what's called an indirect tax. Some nations have that instead of an income tax or in addition to an income tax. And an indirect tax is generally a tax on consumption. In the U.S., we call them sales tax. Although there is no national sales tax, we know our sales tax is a state and a local tax. Other nations use different names, like a VAT tax, which stands for a value-added tax. Governments will sometimes put these taxes only on luxury items so that those that are very, very poor don't have to pay that tax. We know even in New York State, to an extent, that's done. We know that most food items that you buy at a grocery store, they don't have a sales tax. We know that clothing has a lower sales tax. A lot of medications, you don't have to pay taxes. So again, that's done in a way so it tries not to really hurt those people that really can't afford the tax. So we talked about a progressive tax. A progressive tax is like our income tax in the U.S. The more you make, the more you pay. The less you make, the less you pay. The idea of that is to try to create equity. A regressive tax is the opposite. As income rises, you pay a lower percentage of a proportion of your income in taxes. Sales taxes are an example of a regressive tax. If I'm paying 8% sales tax on something that I buy, and my income is $1 million, that sales tax is relatively insignificant. If my income is $10,000, that sales tax becomes a bigger punishment. And so that's why we call it a regressive tax. And then there's a proportional tax. We don't have a lot of examples of that in the United States, but that would be, as your income rises, the percent of your income always stays the same. So I'm always going to pay the same let's say 10%, whether I make $10,000 or $10 million. Now, by definition, 10% of 10 million is a lot more, so I'm still paying more in an absolute value, but by percentage, I'm paying less. Percentage, I'm paying the same. Okay, so that's how the government would collect money. And then we know that the government would then have to redistribute that money if they're trying to create equity. And the first way that they can do it is by what we call transfer payments. We looked at that earlier in the year. That's when they take government revenue, however they got it, and they transfer it directly back to people through social programs. That would be what we would think of as welfare, a lot of our social welfare programs, Social Security, food stamps, Medicare, Medicaid. It's basically the government taking taxpayer money and giving it directly back to people. And in a lot of those cases, not all cases, not necessarily like Social Security or Medicare, for example, but in some of those cases, it's designed to try to create more equity. Okay? And the other way that the government can create equity is by using that money on what we would call government spending on essential goods and services. Where the government might take some of that money and actually pay for utilities for those that can't afford it, pay for food, pay for health care for the poor, and give it directly to them. So again, that would generally be another way of trying to increase equity. So, does the United States do these things? Do we have progressive taxes? Sure. And regressive taxes? Do we redistribute some? Yes. Does it create equity in the United States? It creates more equity. Does it create enough equity? Well, you know what? That's a question for you guys. And that's a question for politicians. And that's a question that we've debated in the halls of Congress for decades. We know that in the United States, you can look up the statistics on your phone, that there are many people who, not many people, there are a few people who are making absurd sums of money. And that there is a percentage of the population that is very poor in the United States. So the question for you guys is that fair? Is that equitable? And there's no easy answer to that, because obviously some of the ultra rich in our country have done some pretty amazing things to gain that wealth. And the question is, should the government have a role in redistributing that wealth? If so, how? What's fair? So this is a loaded question, or really political. I'm not going to be here to supervise this discussion, so hopefully you guys can keep it clean. But if you guys want to have a discussion on equity and income and the role of government, then now would be the time. Get out your phones or your Chromebooks. You can look up some stats. I think you'll find them fascinating. So we'll see you guys later. Hopefully I'll be back soon.